In thinking about how to respond to Pittsburgh, one of the questions that I ask as a historian is, how do we interpret the significance of this event? When we look back at Jewish history, when I teach my Jewish history classes, a lot of times violence against Jews, anti-Semitism, are key dates and periods, and how we define different periods in Jewish history. And anybody who's taken a Jewish history class has probably remembered the dates such as Kristallnacht in 1938 or the Kishinev pogroms in 1903. These are days that are turning points and crucial moments in how we understand the Jewish past. Interestingly, there are other events, especially those events of anti-Semitism and violence, that are probably less well known to most American Jews, and I think Americans more broadly. I wonder how many people here would know much about the Leo Frank lynching in 1915 and the 1958 bombing of a temple in Atlanta. So there are other incidents of anti-Semitism and violence against Jews in the United States. And one thing that's interesting from the perspective of a Jewish historian is that when we tell the story of Jewish history in Europe, we often focus on some of the anti-Semitism and violence as trying to understand what the relationship was between Jews and their host societies. And in the United States, we tend to downplay some of those stories of violence against Jews because the story of American Jewish life is often one of American exceptionalism, that the Jewish experience here in the United States is fundamentally different than the experience in Europe. And one big question that I think this event raises, at least for me, the first sort of, after I got over some of the just personal and emotional responses to this, was how does this incident, how does this terrible act of violence against Jews and the rising nature of anti-Semitism more broadly in the country today, how do we understand that in the larger scope of Jewish history and thinking about whether or not anti-Semitism is exceptional, whether the United States is exceptional or not vis-a-vis anti-Semitism? So that's one question that I think our panelists are going to think about tonight, is how to understand this event in the broader context of American Jewish history and how it relates to European Jewish history and other Jewish histories. And the second open question for me that hopefully our panelists will get to tonight in their responses is, how do we interpret the interpretations of this event? One thing that I think has already happened looking around is we see very different ways of understanding what is the significance of this. And a lot of it has been across some of the major political divides that we see in our country today, and whether or not we understand this event as being incited by the right and by the Trump presidency, or those on the other side who argue that this is an event that is really the continuation of anti-Semitism in this country and isn't anything super exceptional, and in fact the most dangerous anti-Semitism remains left-wing anti-Semitism rather than right-wing anti-Semitism. So that's also something interesting to think about, and hopefully our respondents will address some of those questions tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Noam, for convening us today, and to my colleagues for participating, and for all of you for being here. What I'd like to do is, I want to frame my comments in kind of a broader perspective, to think about Pittsburgh and anti-Semitism specifically, but also in connection to another kind of movement which it's inextricably linked, which is that of white nationalism, and to think about the Pittsburgh murders in connection to the double murder of 2 African Americans in Louisville, and to other recent incidents that are, I think, part of a broader story that we're seeing unfolding right now in the United States. And I would suggest that it's a conceptual mistake to separate these tragedies from each other. And it's also a mistake to not acknowledge the specific role that anti-Semitism has played in this larger phenomenon that we're seeing developing. Noam mentioned the concept of American Jewish exceptionalism, and what I want to do in my couple of minutes is to sort of address 3 kinds of interpretations, or 3 tropes that have emerged as a result and in the wake of the Pittsburgh shooting. And I'd like to suggest, for me personally, I was not so shocked. I mean, I was devastated, but it did not come so much as a shock to me to see this kind of anti-Jewish violence in this country. And I think that's because we have this idea of American Jewish exceptionalism. You know, there's this Spielberg's film, you've probably seen it, The American Tale, in which one of the choruses, there are no cats. The protagonist is a a mouse. There are no cats in America. In other words, America is a place in which there is no anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a thing of the old world. Jews are welcomed in the United States. They prosper here. They contribute to society. They synthesize their Jewishness and their Americanness. And the foundational proof text of that idea of American Jewish exceptionalism has been invoked repeatedly in the wake of the tragedy by NPR, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Tablet Magazine, the Jewish Journal in LA, and that is President George Washington's famous letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island in 1790, where he indicates that the United States government gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. The United States is a land of toleration, where everyone will sit in safety under his vine and fig tree. But what is not commented upon is the irony of those promises of toleration and safety, which become clear once we recognize that Washington owned slaves, that the founder of the Torah synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, not only owned slaves, but also traded slaves. The United States was not exactly a place where everyone, depends on how we're defining who counts as a person here, would sit in safety under his vine and fig tree. That would be a privilege reserved for white people, whites who practice different faiths. Protestantism initially, and now Judaism and also Catholicism is added. They would be tolerated, and only they would be ostensibly guaranteed the exercise of their natural rights. That same year, 1790, Congress passed the first Naturalization Act, which indicated that a foreigner need only one thing in order to become an American citizen. That meaning you needed to be a free white person. This was United States naturalization law, essentially from 1790 to 1952. After the Civil War, people of African descent are added, but if you're not white or you're not black, you're excluded from the prospect of citizenship in this country. And within this framework, part of the implication of Washington's letter is that European Jews were going to be white. Their whiteness was contingent, however, and in part, upon their complicity in anti-black racism, in anti-indigeneity. America was thus exceptional for Jews because they were not, as in Europe, the principal other, but rather, to the contrary, they participated in the oppression of the other. And this is hard to accept because we have a different kind of narrative. We have a very special narrative about Jews in the United States, and I think it's now time to come to terms with some of the darker chapters of this history. Returning to Washington's letter, it also belied a sense of Jews' lingering difference, and not only in terms of religion. Indeed, the seed was planted for the possible revocation of their status as white and protected. Washington refers here to Jews as the children of the stock of Abraham. And this language of stock is about descent, it is about blood. Essentially, it is about understanding Jews as a particular race. In this other angle, the sense of Jews as a racial community would be activated at various times over the course of American history, and especially in the 20th century with rising nativism. A senator right here nearby in Tacoma, Albert Johnson, was a member of the Klan, the KKK, and he initiated the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. He was anti-black and anti-Asian, and also vociferously anti-Semitic, and he wanted to keep Jews out, whom he referred to as filthy, un-American, and dangerous in their habits. He saw immigration restriction as a bulwark against alien blood, and as a way to ensure, as then President Coolidge declared, paraphrasing one of the Klan's slogans, that America must remain American. The idea of Jewish exceptionalism in America was and is perhaps fragile. It's been that way from the beginning. The lingering sense of Jewish difference also contained in the kernel of the kernel for Jewish activism and allyship, for immigrant rights and civil rights and other causes. It may appear that those initiatives were undertaken as privileged acts of altruism and social justice, but they have also been acts of Jewish self-defense. This leads to the second idea that I wanted to touch on. The idea that this attack was against a community of faith or against a religious group. Kellyanne Conway blamed the shooting on generalized anti-religiosity. Sessions characterized the massacre as an attack on all people of faith. And from a completely different perspective, a survivor of the shooting in the Jewish Federation here in Seattle back in 2006 described the Pittsburgh victims as being targeted just for practicing their faith. Yes, they were attacked in a synagogue, but it's very important to recognize the framework that the shooter brought to bear here. He was not interested in faith. He was not interested in Judaism as a religion. The perpetrator saw Jews as a race, a biological community of shared blood and immutable loyalty. He used racial slurs in his social media posts, and he subscribes to far-right conspiracy theories, such as Jews secretly organizing a war against the right race, that they're orchestrating a term that is known as white genocide that's been popularized in recent years. Apparently by supporting refugees and the caravan, for example, Muslims and Latinos, the Jews are imagined as coordinating the demographic and cultural displacement of white Christians in America. That is why, at the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, the torchbearers were chanting, of all the things they were chanting, Jews will not replace us. The Pittsburgh shooter's vision of anti-Semitism should be understood as a form of racism. The German writer who coined the term anti-Semitism in 1879 saw himself and like-minded people as against Jews as a race. What we understand from this is that anti-Semitism may not be systemic in this country. It is different from other forms of racism because most Jews operate in the world as white. But we must also recognize that it does exist. Perhaps it never went away. And rather than being systemic, it can have cataclysmic effects. Finally, one of the other claims made about the shooter is that he was a lone shooter, or he was crazy. And I think it's very important to recognize that we take a broader context and a broader approach here. He was seeing himself as part of a broader movement. He invoked the numbers 1488, which refer to the 14 words. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. You can see it's in that image right there. It's 1488. It says, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children," which was a phrase inspired by Hitler's Mein Kampf. The two eights referred to the eighth letter of the alphabet, H, Heil Hitler. And these are the same numbers that were invoked by Dylan Roof, the white man who murdered 9 parishioners at the black church in Charlottesville in 2005, and he brought 88 bullets with him. The white man who murdered four people at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin in 2012. And 1488 has also been invoked by people like Richard Spencer, who popularized the term alt-right and seeks to make it mainstream. The terminological acrobatics are a strategy of rebranding. Skinhead, white supremacist, white nationalist, alt-right, race realist, they all share in common an affection for Hitler and an obsession with the Jews. They are, in many ways, neo-Nazis by other names. An undercover journalist concluded, after spending a lot of time with these groups, that anti-Semitism is the main fuel that animates white nationalism. Only liberation from Jews will achieve the racial utopia that white nationalists anticipate. And the president's tweets, and he has retweeted people advocating and this idea of white genocide. I suggest that they have emboldened and helped to mainstream, perhaps mainstream again, anti-Semitism as a key ingredient of white nationalism that people like the Pittsburgh shooter have interpreted as authorization to act.
So I want to start with the Pittsburgh shooter's comments online, where he says that Jews are waging a propaganda war against Western civilization, a war for the extinction of the white race. President Trump regularly refers to the press as the enemy of the people. And I want to take a provocative leap here and suggest that these two comments are conceptually related. They're related because they both grow out of a very old claim that was first lodged at the turn of the century, around 1903 in Russia, a very old claim that was articulated in a forged document, a fake document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And in this document, the authors, who were pro-czarists, monarchists, laid out a scenario, a nightmare scenario, where that purported to be the secret minutes of a cabal of Jewish leaders who were planning to gain control of the world by manipulating governments, by manipulating their finances, by unleashing radical discontent, and by using their control of the press to manipulate public opinion, to confuse the Gentiles about what was really happening in the world. Various versions of this document, the Protocols, are published in Europe in 1920. But they also come to the United States via Russian emigre, anti-Bolshevik writers, and they fall into the hands of one Henry Ford, that great American hero, the working man's friend, the producer of cheap automobiles that were available to most people of the lower middle classes. Henry Ford takes the Protocols, the plot of the Protocols, and turns it into a series of articles, 91 of them, which focus on the particular contributions of American Jews to the plot. In Ford's articles, The International Jew, which were gathered together in 4 volumes, the plot is actually very advanced. It's almost complete. All that's left is the crushing of Christianity. And what's distinctive about the Protocols in Ford's hands is they focus on American Jewish leaders at the top, the string pullers, the master manipulators, the puppeteers, who are in control of the press, who are in control of finance, who are squeezing the United States from the top, while the working classes, the Jewish immigrants in Eastern Europe, are pushing from the bottom, polluting the American labor movement for revolutionary purposes. What's important to remember about Henry Ford and the Protocols is he strikes a match that will continue to burn decade after decade. And I want to just quickly talk about the various iterations of the Protocols. And by the way, the 4 volumes that Henry Ford's organization published were never copyrighted. And they were republished in 16 languages, at least 16. And they live today on the World Wide Web. So Henry Ford claimed not to know what was going on in his organization. But that wasn't true. He knew very well what was going on. So what happens to the Protocols? In the 1930s, the era of the Great Depression, and the era in which pro-Nazi groups are very active in the United States, groups like the German-American Bund, groups like William Dudley Pelley's Silver Shirts, groups like the Christian Front and the Christian Mobilizers, they take up the Protocols and they turn it into something even more sinister. We're not just talking about Jews squeezing Gentiles through using the media. We're talking about the concept of Aryans who are going to peddle this garbage. And here is, interestingly enough, there were various bookstores across the United States, including this one, the Aryan Bookstore, which published these plot cards, a convenient little card that you could carry around in your pocket. The plot to enslave the races, the plot to destroy the races, the plot to control world government, world finances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the key issue for people who believed in this plot was the media. And here we have another iteration of the plot. This is the idea that Roosevelt himself is a Jew or a tool of the Jews, and that the government has been taken over by Jews. You see the Star of David here. The red White House, the red government is a manipulated by the Jews, and the New Deal is the Jew deal. Roosevelt was not a Jew, he was a Protestant. And here we have a very important trope of the protocols, the idea that Jews control the media. We find this in Ford's publications about the International Jew. The Jews control the media, and here we have a very crude, and by the way, the image in the middle, I found it actually in Berlin at an exhibit. This idea that the death of civilization is going to happen because the Jews control Hollywood, and through Hollywood movies they are going to create all these lies and destroy American culture. Now here we have the next iteration. This is America First. This is another great American hero, Charles Lindbergh, who crossed the Atlantic in an airplane in 1927. Both Lindbergh and Henry Ford were awarded special medals by Hitler. So here we have this very elite group of Americans. We're not talking about, anti-Semitic rebel rousers. We're talking about elite, wealthy Americans who belong to this group called America First, an isolationist group that was determined to keep America out of the war in Europe. And so Lindbergh gives this speech, which is now infamous, where he says that the three most important groups agitating for war are the Roosevelt administration, the British, and the Jewish. And he says, instead of agitating for war, Jews in this country should be opposing it in every way, for they will be the first to feel its consequences. Their greatest danger lies to this country, to the United States, lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. And by the way, the Senate held hearings on Hollywood motion pictures, trying to figure out whether they were pushing the United States into the war. So let me just quickly mention a couple of things. And this relates to what Devin was saying. In the 1950s, hate groups, neo-Nazi hate groups, the KKK, neo-Nazi hate groups, were accusing the Jews of being the puppeteers behind the civil rights movement, and that they were trying to destroy American civilization through, encouraging inbreeding between the races. And it wasn't just the temple in Atlanta that was bombed. There's a whole series of synagogue bombings that took place between 1957 and 1958. So jump ahead to this. This is a poster for the audio version of the Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries was written in 1976. And it is a genocide, it is a fantasy about how Jews have taken over the world and used black people as their kind of minions to confiscate weapons from all the true Americans. And so what the Turner Diaries does is envision this apocalyptic landscape where Earl Turner and his secret underground Aryan army commit basically genocide against Jews, black people, not only in the United States, but all over the world. And this relates in interesting ways to the migrant caravan narrative, because one of the things that the Turner Diaries envisions is that Jews are promoting immigration of people, darker people from all over the world to come and pollute the United States. Sasha is going to talk about the George Soros mania, which is kind of where this is right now, this narrative.
There are a number of historical contexts for the Pittsburgh shooting. Devin talked about, here is one. The gun legislation in this country is very unique for a wealthy country, and we have far more deaths by gun violence. A subset of these shootings are far-right, racist, white nationalist acts of political violence. So Devin talked about the Louisville murders, the Charleston murders in 2015, 9 people, and of course the Tree of Life killings. There's a broader context of violence against Jewish institutions that predates the stuff that I'm going to really focus on the talk. A lot of people have been thinking about the 2006 shooting at the Seattle Jewish Federation. I could name many other examples. So none of this is new, and I think you can pick that up from what my colleagues have said. I'm going to focus on something that I think is somewhat different and changing in this current moment, and that is a global realignment of electoral politics that's happening in this country as well as in a lot of other countries in Europe and elsewhere, and the rise of what I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, the alternative right, or the new right. Okay, so this movement is anti-Semitic, although foremost it's most loudly anti-Muslim and anti-immigration, but it's also anti-Semitic, and you see anti-Semitic being really weaponized in politics by these various parties in ways that are certainly reminiscent of what we've seen before, but also in some are somewhat unprecedented, at least in this historical period. Okay, so I'm going to use the German case as an example. Here's this is some of their stupid propaganda. So in 2013, people who were right of center in Germany got a sense that there was open water on the right side of the political spectrum. They weren't happy with the existing conservative parties, particularly with the party of Angela Merkel. They felt like they had moved too much to the center, and they founded a new party called the Alternative for Germany. There are a number of similar parties now in other countries in Europe, and they all have a general set of values in common. They are anti-immigration, they are afraid of immigrants, they are anti-Muslim and anti-Islam, they're in favor of some kind of white Christian nationalism. I think you can see that, that's subtle here, but I think present. Maybe not so subtle. They are mild to explicitly authoritarianism, varying from country to country. So Poland, Hungary, I think explicitly anti-democratic. The Alternative for Germany is, for example, very suspicious of the free press, but more mild. So what political scientists are telling us is that in this moment, the transitions from democratic systems to authoritarian states often aren't dramatic. They're creeping, rather, and they can be difficult to perceive while they're in process. So if you look at the example of Hungary, where there's a far-right anti-Semitic party in power right now with Viktor Orban, the prime minister, you can see examples of this. There basically is no longer a free press in Hungary. It's been gradually crushed out of existence by the government. There have been curtailments, arguably, of civil liberties and the independent court system. And a lot of the Soros stuff really has roots in Hungary, right? So the current attack on the Central European University, which looks like it's going to move to Vienna, is all coming out of Orban's government. Anyway, okay. So, and Sasha hopefully will say more about that. Okay, a similar thing going on in Poland, and Applebaum, who I think is a really astute observer of this, says that what defines the liberals in Poland right now is that they're conservatives who just don't want to lose elections anymore. Okay, so these kinds of parties are also anti-Semitic. But again, they are most loud about their anti-immigration, anti-Muslim views. Germany, I think, is an instructive case for this, right? So this vision that you see here really does not include Jewish Germans. But certainly at first, the Alternative for Germany was very quiet about ties that it had to far-right groups, and it's gotten more and more openly Semitic as it's been more and more successful. Currently, it's the third largest party in the parliament. It gets about 13% of the vote. A lot of its public anti-Semitism takes the form of almost dog whistles, but it's really creeping over into explicit statements. I could say way more about this, but just to boil it down, things like, Germany has a glorious past, let's stop talking about the Nazis and talk more about Beethoven. The Nazis are really just bird poop on what is otherwise a glorious past. So that's a really profoundly anti-Semitic thing to say in public in Germany for a political leader, and it sparked outrage from other politicians, including conservatives. I'm paraphrasing one of the leaders of the party. But what they have found is that this is turning out the vote, that this anti-Semitism turns out the base, that it's helping them. Anti-Semitism is a powerful political tool. We have seen that over since arguably it was developed in the 1870s. Okay, so here's these flyers. These flyers went out in the current congressional elections in a number of districts around the country, Philadelphia, including the Washington 8th district, just south of here, and candidates were Democrats who were Jewish were running. Okay. So we could, my colleagues have given other examples of this, right? That anti-Semitism is being used as a political tool. Okay, so what do I want to say about this? I would just add something about the history of anti-Semitism. Historically, one of the reasons it's so powerful is that it's this anti-rational conspiracy theory that can really explain a lot of different things, especially economic problems. So Hannah Arendt argued that anti-Semitism was the answer to communism. And in the communist model, if you've got it bad in the economy, little guy or little girl, it's because you're being exploited by the bourgeoisie. Anti-Semitism, no, it's not. The problem isn't capitalism. The problem is the Jews. If we just get rid of the Jews, capitalism will work. I think that's worth keeping in mind when you think about how it's being instrumentalized. Conspiracy theories are incredibly powerful as well. Okay, but moving on about what I want to say about this. So the first thing is, this anti-Semitism is part of this global trend, the rise of a new right. So to do something about it, we've got to think about it as part of this larger reconstellation of politics. Unfortunately, it's helping them. It's not hurting them. It's helping them turn out the vote in these countries. It's helping them gain support for authoritarianism in Hungary. Okay, here's some good news. There are signs that there are limits to how much this alternative right movement can really win people over, I hope. So as much as the Alternative for Germany has been successful, it's only the third largest party. Last night, the Democrats made big gains in suburban congressional districts that normally vote Republicans. So the 8th district in Washington State is an example of that. Okay, and what should we do? What should we do? Okay, so one thing is that I think it would be great if we could get back to a normal conservative party and strengthen conservative parties, not just in this country, but in other countries as well. And there are people who are really focused on this. One of them is Jim Comey, I know, who was out canvassing yesterday for a Democratic candidate in Virginia and said, this is beyond Democrats or Republicans or independents. This is about the values of our country. So Republicans, take back your party, I think is one of the best hopes that we have here. Here are some other suggestions. Okay, so it's never a good idea to give up on a functioning democratic system or really use it or lose it here, even if things don't seem like they're working that well. Protect the rule of law. So if the executive in your country, for example, interferes in a functioning criminal investigation in a way that really undermines the rule of law, peaceful street protest would be a possible response to that. A general strike in a very extreme situation, a peaceful general strike can be a very powerful tactic. A united opposition, right? So what happened in 1933 in Germany is the people from moderates to the far left cannot get behind some kind of a coalition response to fascism. That's a problem. And finally, win elections. Okay, so this is not going to go away as long as it's succeeding. Thank you.
So I guess I am to speak about things that other people didn't want to talk about, and I'm also here to represent the land of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, as a Soviet emigre who comes from the country that gave the world the protocols. So that's enough for my jokes. I'm here also as a literature scholar and a scholar of culture, and also somebody who teaches literature and culture. And I'm here to kind of do what I teach my students to do, which is to kind of pause to think about a deeply complicated image or a word or a sentence in a work of art that emerges in response to whatever it emerges in response to. And after Pittsburgh, I was looking for such an image to think about, and there's one that I'll talk about. This is in better times. I used to teach a course called Introduction to Jewish Culture, where I assigned my students this museum assignment, where I would give them an object that would somehow be so complex and so particular to the specific moment when we were living that they would have to contextualize it as though they were writing a caption for the museum built in the future. Right. So Minurki, this is in better times, 2015. When Thanksgiving and Hanukkah happened at the same time, which of course in America produced all kinds of nonsense like this, but makes for a fantastic museum exhibit, a complicated object with a caption that needs to be written. We're now in times like this. This I looked at for today. You can buy a MAGA set of dreidels for your Trump-loving relatives, Jewish relatives, I suppose. online. So this would be also in that museum. And then finally, it brings me to thinking about how I was, after Pittsburgh, looking for such an item that I could hold on to that I know will be defined, defining of this moment in the future. So I was looking to cartoons as a scholar of culture. This is one that could possibly do that. We're on the cusp of the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht. This is by Rob Rogers, the cartoonist who was fired from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette earlier this year because of the takeover of the newspaper by a Trump-friendly owner. So going back to Laurie's comment about the free press. But that's not the image that I'm really thinking will stick, and this is the elephant in the room. So this is a cartoon. I guess the caption went away. The cartoon is by Eli Valley, who is a Jewish cartoonist who painted this, my caption said, on October 29th, 2018, a day after the Pittsburgh shooting. And what I'm going to do now for the next 5 minutes is to walk us through this image, and we'll get back to it in the end to show you what it is that Eli Valley does and why I think this is a Jewish work of art that I'm going to be holding onto as an item that defines this moment. So how did we get to here? So the Soros that others left to me to talk about is the Jewish, Hungarian-born Holocaust survivor investor who for decades now have been invested in open society projects, especially in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, various democratizing projects. And this is from last summer in Hungary, where there was a massive campaign against Soros, accusing him of manipulating politicians. So here you have Soros as a puppeteer next to an image from Nazi Germany in the 1930s that I'm juxtaposing it with, that there's direct anti-Semitic references. What are they unhappy with Soros for? Soros was blamed for sponsoring a version of the caravan that we're talking about now, the Syrian refugees that have been flooding into East European countries, and Hungary is one of these countries. So the nationalist backlash in Hungary so these are also posters in Hungary at the time to stop this migration of people that gets sort of defined as a project of Soros. There's posters around Hungary in 2017 in the summer. Don't let Soros laugh at the end, suggesting he's behind the refugee crisis. 99% say no to illegal migration. New poster campaign in Hungary in 2017. So this is the summer of 2017 when this is happening. Of course, when you put a nice, clean poster up with a provocative message, you then allow it to exist in the public sphere, in which case it gets defaced in ways that amplify the message that it's intending to give, thus kind of opening up the space where this hate can really flourish. So here, of course, defaced with the word vampire. So you add a little blood to his face, and you turn Soros, the Jewish puppeteer, into this kind of puppet master. So this year during an election campaign in Hungary, where Viktor Orban really weaponized this connection to Soros. We're fighting an enemy that is different from us, not open but hiding, not straightforward but crafty, not honest but base, not national but international, does not believe in working but speculates with money, does not have its own homeland but feels its own the whole world. Right? These are not just anti-Semitic dog whistles. This is straight up anti-Semitism. Note the nationalism and internationalism, globalism and nationalism that Trump claimed is the priority for our country at the moment. These are the exact same words that Trump is saying in America, now being said, this is in Hungary, during an election campaign. Now back to that poster, the image that I started with, I'm coming back to Eli Valley. This is the elephant in the room. One thing we have to think about is that one of the people in the world today who is so aligned with the right-wing regimes that traffic in anti-Semitic stereotypes is Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. I'm not saying he is anti-Semite. He is using anti-Semitic tropes in the very same way as Viktor Orban does in Hungary, as Trump does in the United States. So this is Viktor Orban and Netanyahu hosting Orban in Jerusalem in July 2018. This is April 2018, right, when Orban gives his, various campaign speeches that traffic an open anti-Semitic discourse, right? So I'm going to drive this point home, superimpose the text on this lovely play with the Rubik's Cube that has Hungarian color flags, flags with the color of the Hungarian flags in it. Think about how during the campaign of 2017 and 2018, Israel's ambassador to Hungary had posted a Facebook message that called on Hungary to cease this anti-Soros propaganda because it was so anti-Semitic. Israel's foreign ministry had commented on the words of its own ambassador to say in no way was the statement from the ambassador meant to delegitimize criticism of George Soros, who continuously undermines Israel democratically elected governments by funding organizations that defame the Jewish state and seek to deny it the right to defend itself. Soros supports, like he does in other countries, open society projects. He supports various groups like B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence that in various ways support different balances on Israel's right-wing regime and the occupation. So here is Israel's foreign ministry officially condemning its own ambassador in the very same language that is used in Hungary. How do we come to this country? Russia is another important nexus point for anti-Soros mania, has been for a long time. Putin is dead set against Soros as somebody who also supports all kinds of NGOs. Putin made NGOs illegal in Russia, or he made the financials of supporting them illegal in the last few years. This is the cover image for the DC Leaks website during the 2016 presidential campaign, which uses the images from Ferguson, Missouri, from protests after the killing in Ferguson, superimposes upon them the image of George Soros, and claims to have documents that tell the American audience how they're being manipulated. This image gets retweeted by Steve King, re-elected last night to his congressional seat in Iowa, who writes that it's Soros's plan for America too. PM Orban's view is deeply well-informed and reasoned. Right, first it's retweeted by Orban. Steve King was one of Trump's co-chairs of his presidential campaign. He's an avowed white nationalist, by kind of confirming that name, so we have that connection. And obviously Trump has done it so many times, I don't need to give you all of the examples, but this is one in early October 2018, dates are really important, where he blames Kavanaugh protesters as being supported by Soros. So how do I come back to, just one minute, I'm really coming back to this is from the National Republican Congressional Committee ad in the Minnesota 1st congressional race in late October of this year, supporting the Republican candidate, right? And what it does, it has Soros sitting with a pile of money, right? This is your anti-Semitic image. Next to him, you can't really see it, is Colin Kaepernick, who has been the black football player who has led the protests against police violence, and calling him connoisseurs of chaos. And then I had the image that Devin already showed us, the tweet of Robert Bowers before he went in to the synagogue to shoot. So how do we get here? Eli Valley, October 29, 2018. I'm going to claim this is a Jewish work of art that takes a particularly Jewish response to the current tragedy in Pittsburgh and tries to connect these dots in ways that are really brilliant, brutal, honest, and absolutely necessary for us to take in. He's painting Benjamin Netanyahu in front of the poster of George Soros as the evil, demonic figure. He's painting on it the words Kike Soros, because he has, in effect, didn't use those terms, but his government has used anti-Semitic propaganda against Soros in his support. And to our brothers and sisters in America, the State of Israel says solidarity, right? This has been the response of the Israeli government to the Pittsburgh shooting. Today in the presser that Trump gave, he was asked about the 57% rise in the anti-Semitic incidents, his answer was, well, they like me in Israel, right? I'm paraphrasing, but that was his answer. That is immediately how the right-wing, Jewish right-wing responds to the tragedy in Pittsburgh. It shifts the focus from focusing on white nationalism and anti-Semitism as a root of white nationalism, or one of the causes or reasons of white nationalism in this country, and turns any criticism of the Trump administration to their support of Israel, right? But as I hope I showed, right, Israel is itself complicit in the kind of demonization of Soros and the trafficking in anti-Semitic stereotypes that have led us to the killing in Pittsburgh. And then I'll conclude with this. This is Eli Valley wants to let us know that at the bottom of the image, it's right here at the bottom under the date, he had written the word Zachor, right? And he kind of zooms in on that. And this is his tweet explaining why he did it. In the signature, I added the Hebrew Zachor for remember. We must remember those who were murdered in Pittsburgh. We must also remember what Netanyahu has wrought, his demonization of Soros, his vilification of refugees, and his celebration of anti-Semitic fascist movements around the world. So I'll conclude with this, and looking forward to Kathie finishing this up.
As a sociologist of international migration and refugees, I want to focus my brief remarks on the role Jewish Americans are currently playing in the humanitarian protection of immigrants and refugees. I'll start by explaining what part HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and its support for immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees of all faiths and nationalities played in the shooting. Next, I'll explore the growth of the Jewish American movement to protect immigrants and refugees and the benefits of that mobilization, and I'll end with some recommendations as well. But before I even get started, I need to confide in you some of my feelings over these past horrible couple of weeks, and it's not over yet. As an American Jewish academic, maybe they will confirm some of your feelings, maybe not. First, the shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue brought me back to those childhood fears of where would I hide and who would anyone and who would protect me if it happened here. Though some of my best colleagues and friends disagree with the need for a legal asylum system or an international legal framework of refugee protection because it benefits only a privileged few, I know, as an American Jewish scholar of immigrant and refugee studies, that if 6 million European Jews had not been denied entry to safe countries and thus locked inside Europe, they would not have been murdered. There were not enough righteous people of good conscience in Europe to save them. So because I'm not a mystery writer, and there won't be any surprise ending, and Noam will probably shut me up before I'm done, I'll tell you now that HIAS's wisdom, flexibility, and farsightedness is absolutely essential to this moment in history. And I will also argue that it needs to be backed up with a humane and functioning U.S. and international system of asylum and refugees that embraces the protection of everyone. What we are witnessing now is a systematic plan to narrow, if not entirely dismantle, U.S. and international humanitarian policy, and to introduce a new era of asylum and refugee policy based on deterrence and no entry. I'm going to repeat that again, no entry. That is what we are headed for. That is what we are moving for. And as no small aside, it's been mentioned briefly a moment ago, I respectfully suggest gun control too. Okay, part one. What is the significance of HIAS in the shootings at the Tree of Life? As you know, and it has been said by each person on the panel, the gunman did not only shout, "All Jews must die," but he also wrote on social media, "HIAS likes to bring invaders in that kill our people." This clearly refers to HIAS's most recent public support of the caravan of Central American asylum seekers fleeing violence, who are slowly making their way north. But it also refers to the mobilization of American Jews in early 2017 against the Muslim ban. Central American, Muslim, and Middle Eastern immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers have been stereotyped as violent criminals rather than as survivors of violence. The Tree of Life Synagogue was one of more than 300 Jewish congregations in 33 states that had celebrated National Refugee Shabbat on October 20th. HIAS, founded in 1881 to help Jews fleeing the violence of pogroms in Europe, is now one of 9 voluntary organizations with contracts from the U.S. State Department to help administer resettlement services to refugees from all over the world. Of these 9 agencies, HIAS is the only one with Jewish roots, and that's why I think it specifically was attacked this time. The International Rescue Committee is the only one that is not faith-based. The rest are based in Christianity. At the end of the war in Vietnam, the State Department asked HIAS to help resettle Southeast Asian refugees in the United States. And that was really the first time HIAS started resettling people that weren't of Jewish background and origin. HIAS has helped more than 4.5 million people of all backgrounds escape persecution and resettle. Now, all of the 9 agencies administer resettlement services to refugees of all faiths and nationalities. But because there's only 9 agencies for the whole country, their services have been supplemented in different communities by smaller local community-based organizations. So for an example, in Seattle, we have Refugee Women's Alliance or the East African Community Services, and they supplement the work of major organizations like HIAS. In the present political moment, all these agencies are seeing very extreme declines in the numbers of refugees admitted to the United States, and they're concerned about keeping their doors open, their staff and services available, so people are being laid off. There are ongoing legal challenges to President Trump's executive actions to ban refugees from most Muslim countries, to lower the number of refugees. So now we have a drop of from about 85,000 to 30,000. And to revoke the temporary protection of people of many nationalities. At the same time, there is a systematic slowdown in processing applications of those permitted to apply. Only 1,500 refugees from all of Latin America and the Caribbean are permitted entry to the United States. That is the ceiling. That's the maximum number allowable, 1,500. But as of June 2018, only 126 refugees from that region have been admitted. 126. Frankly, new executive actions are not really needed anymore to break our immigration and refugee system. They're more for show to rally Trump's base. It's winding down through deliberate, systematic, bureaucratic slowdown and inaction. I want to move on to talk about the mobilization of Jewish Americans to protect immigrants and refugees of all faiths and nationalities. This topic's of recent research interest to me, one I plan to explore more systematically, but it first started to come to my awareness with the 1980s sanctuary movement, which primarily involved networks of churches protecting the lives of Central Americans fleeing violence in their countries, violence that was triggered, if not supported, by U.S. foreign policy, and especially Guatemala and El Salvador. Jewish Americans had a presence in that movement, but not like today. In 1995, what is now the Union for Reform Judaism produced a resolution on immigration which declared, "We support those efforts that compassionately seek to regulate and to aid newcomers to this land, but we oppose those that will unduly restrict immigration or burden the lives of illegal immigrants." I really started to take notice with the Jewish movement to end genocide in Darfur and to support the Darfuri refugees, which started around 2004. By 2006, the Central Conference of American Rabbis adopted a resolution that included a legal path, a path to legality for undocumented Americans. By 2007, the new sanctuary movement was pressuring President Obama to end his mass deportations of non-criminals without legal papers and to create DACA. But this was nothing like what we saw in February 2017. That's when President Trump issued what became widely known as the Muslim ban. The director of HIAS, Mark Hetfield, advised the agency's supporters to, and I quote, stand up and fight back. Bend the Arc, a Jewish organization that works on domestic social justice issues, mobilized its members and urged them to attend emergency protest rallies around the country and to flood Congress with calls. The leader of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, called Trump's executive order cruel and contrary to the values of our country. With reference to the Holocaust, he said further, Jewish history and heritage compel us to take a stand. The American Jewish Committee stated that the terrorist threat attributed to refugees is a cruel and distracting fiction, and that the executive order is targeted primarily at Muslims fleeing violence and oppression and reinforces anti-Muslim stereotypes. The Orthodox movement claimed discrimination against any group based solely upon religion is wrong and anathema to the great traditions of religious and personal freedoms upon which this country is founded. Trua, an organization which seeks to place rabbis and cantors at the forefront of the Jewish struggle for human rights and social justice, condemned Trump's executive order. If you Google Trua, if you Google HIAS, you will find two guides to how to form a sanctuary movement in your community. By June 2017, over 800 different faith communities, including Jews, had declared themselves part of the new sanctuary movement. Now I want to move on to some recommendations which have more to do with this slide. Yeah. One thing that makes the shooting at the Pittsburgh synagogue different than past acts of violent anti-Semitism is the supportive response of non-Jews. This has given me pause. The massive mobilization of Jewish Americans and Jewish organizations against the Muslim ban was so important. It was critical, in fact, to the North American Muslim response to the shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The outpouring of sympathy and support has been awe-inspiring. A continent-wide crowdfunding campaign started in my hometown, Detroit, called Muslims Unite for Pittsburgh Synagogue raised more than $200,000 in 4 days. Muslim communities across the country are performing solidarity circles, literally standing around Jewish congregations, quote, to show our support in numbers and stand in pursuit of justice for this heinous crime against our human family. After a deadly attack on a mosque in Quebec, Christians and Jews had formed human rings of peace around mosques in Canada to help Muslim worshippers feel safer on their way in. This past weekend, several hundred people arriving in busloads from different mosques did the same for 6 synagogues in Toronto to show their support for the Jewish community in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. So I like the number 7, I don't know why. Here's my 7 recommendations. They're not necessarily in order of importance. First, redouble efforts to build bridges and maintain networks between diverse communities in the United States. Our immediate and future safety and protection is in supporting each other. That's how we build enough or more than enough people of good conscience when our communities are threatened. 2, don't back down. Continue to lobby Congress to create a humane and just asylum and refugee system that embraces everyone, including victims of domestic and gang violence when their countries of origin can't or won't protect them. 3, demand that Congress, and we have the House, demand that Congress recommend refugee quotas that rise to the level of the wealth and strength of this country. There are 25 million refugees in the world. The U.S. should be a leader for the world and should use its standing to pressure other countries to take responsibility for refugees and asylum seekers according to their capacities. 4, work to create or maintain community organizations that protect immigrants and refugees. 5, advocate for local policy that funds those organizations and protects sanctuary. 6, advocate and provide practical support for specific individuals and families. And 7, maybe this is my top one tonight. 7, most people make up their minds about immigrants and refugees because of a personal connection or experience, or a close friend or relative has talked to them of their own experience. So talk to your friends, relatives, and neighbors. That's how we change hearts and minds.